Now, here are Morgan Streetman and Roxanne Wilder.
And Pat George, the three of us together on this dreary day, but we're getting through it with all kinds of information from local news happenings to around the world.
They call us the Three Musketeers, don't they?
Is that what they call us?
They call us a lot of things.
Is that what they call us? Of course that's what they call us.
How long have
Three
we been doing
amigos.
this? We've been doing this a while now.
Coming up on 5 years.
Wow!
Is that right?
5 full years, yeah.
Well, it's weird because I do feel like I've known Morgan forever.
Yeah,
on
I know.
one hand.
I thought it was
But then
4.
on the other hand, time flies when you're having fun, right?
It really does. Really does. And, we've been having a lot of fun on this show through the years. We got started out, some of our longtime listeners will remember that we started out as a legal call-in show.
Mm-hmm.
You remember those days, the good old days? We did that for, about 6 or 8 months. And then that was at the beginning. That was right when President Trump came down that escalator at the Trump Tower and started his campaign for president.
That's right.
And we just started throwing in a few little things about that, talking a little bit about the politics. And boy, did we get some good response from our audience on that. So we just have kind of expanded into that.
You weren't the biggest Trump fan back then.
No, I really wasn't. And, I still wonder how well I would get along with him if I was like his friend. Of course, we don't.
Probably not well.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that at least my perception of his style is generally not what I tend to, gravitate
towards
yeah.
in terms of who you want to go have a drink with.
Pretty much.
Right.
That's pretty much it. So, but nevertheless, since he's become our president, we've tried to recognize the fact that we're all in this together in this country, and we're all kind of, at least I grew up in a tradition where you would generally try to support the president, even if you disagreed with the president. And, I certainly disagreed, as I've been very open about sharing, certainly disagreed heartily with President Obama from the beginning of his presidency and throughout. There wasn't much that he did that I could find favor with. But that being said, I tried also to just generally not have Obama derangement syndrome or ODS. None of us had that, if you notice. None of us were out in the middle of the square screaming, blood-curdling screams about, who knows what, just screaming. That's what people are doing today. They just can't take it anymore. They're just melting down. I can't even be your friend anymore if you support the president. I hear that from people. And I've heard that from friends of mine. I can't be friends with you. It's like, well, if what goes on inside of my head and the way that I view things is some kind of prerequisite for our friendship, well, then, I'm an independent and freedom-loving person. And so, if that's how it has to be, then I'm sorry, that's how it has to be. I don't think it's right for you to try to impose your views on someone else. And I've certainly never, in my experience, never made that some kind of a criteria for my friendships. I've never said, you know what, you're very liberal or you're a socialist, and I'm not going to be friends with you. I'm not going to dialogue with you. I'm not going to share my thoughts with you or relate to you in any way because of what you already believe.
You bite your tongue.
What do you mean?
You just don't say anything about that.
No,
you just keep it yourself.
I have throughout my entire life made it a point of actively seeking out relationships with people that I don't agree with. I've done that my entire life. Now, I'll tell
That's
you,
healthy because then you can have advanced discourse and try to see what someone else thinks and maybe possibly learn from them and vice versa. And at the end of the day, be very happy that we are all able to speak our mind on these various subjects freely.
Well, iron sharpens iron, right? I mean, you develop your own concepts and the theoretical basis for what you think by dialoguing with other people, by having your thoughts, your conclusions, your beliefs challenged in some way. That actually strengthens them, and maybe, just maybe, there are times when you come to realize that your viewpoint wasn't the correct viewpoint or wasn't the one that you want to maintain going forward. So you've got all that at play, which happens when you're dialoguing only with people you don't already agree with. I talk to people and I tell them, if we're only talking to people that we already agree with or that already agree with us, however you want to look at it, we're not making any progress. That's called preaching to the choir, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you already got the choir. The choir already believes what the preacher is saying. You need to get the people that aren't coming to church. And I'm using that as an analogy, but, point is, if you're only talking to people that you already agree with, you're not making any progress. So you got to talk to people you don't agree with. It's getting harder and harder, though.
And it's really interesting. During this pandemic, we've seen it become so politicized so that it's very clear cut. If you're on the blue side, then you are definitely saying that you need to stay home because you don't care about other people, about getting other people sick. If you're on the red side, then you're saying, oh, no, you need to get back to work, or you don't care about the economy and people paying their bills and putting food on the table of their children. When you have those conversations, whether it's us talking in this room or politicians or whomever or friends at the bar, well, they're not at the bar right now, but friends talking, you have to come from a place of knowing you care about both of those scenarios and believing that they care about both of those scenarios.
Right.
Otherwise, you're not going to get anywhere.
Right. Yeah, if you don't have some basic level of respect for your dialogue partner or your audience's perspective, that people, reasonable minds can disagree as to what the right thing to do is in the scenario. With the facts or what we think we know about the facts, take, for instance, this coronavirus pandemic, what we think we know about it, what do we do? And you know what? Some people can say, well, we need to do one thing, and some people can say we need to do another thing. And, they're, like you said, Roxanne, they're both coming from the same place. So it's you need to have a degree of respect for the people that you're talking to and their views.
It's
and
been another week.
Mm-hmm.
What's your view on that now, on the virus? It's been another week since we've seen you. Where are we at now? Where do you think? Have we made any progress?
Well, I do think we're making progress. I think when you look at our country in context of other countries, one that stands out in particular is Sweden, because they did not do the things that we've done in this country, that the lockdown, so to speak. Now, they apparently did some degree of social distancing, and people sort of kept their distance, which that's probably smart. But they didn't go into the full lockdown, quarantine mode that we have largely in this country that we're now trying to come out of. They didn't shut their entire economy down. They didn't close down the restaurants and the stores and things like that. And they seem to have fared about the same as we did. Now, you could say a lot of things about that. You say, well, Sweden's a much smaller country, with just over 10 million people. It's much more spread out, but in Stockholm it's not. In Stockholm it's pretty dense population-wise. It may not be quite as bad as New York, because I don't know that there's only a couple of places as bad as New York, I think, like Tokyo, Singapore, a few other places in this whole world that are as densely populated as New York City. But in any event, Sweden did not engage in the shutdown that we did, and they seem to have come out of it pretty all right. And if you read the news articles, and who knows what to trust exactly, but you read the news articles, and we're understanding that they're almost getting to a point of herd immunity in Sweden. And that's what we're being told. That's where we need to get to. So wait a minute. They're already there. They didn't suffer appreciably more than we did. Of course, there are so many things, and it's almost hard to talk about this. There are so many things we don't know. We don't have any idea how many people in this country have had it and had no symptoms. But a lot of the studies that have been done, a lot of the research that's been done is indicated that it's a large percentage. Something maybe between 85 and 95% of people that get this don't have any symptoms at all. Or the symptoms are so mild that you might mistake it for just a common cold, right? So,
or allergies.
Which, by the way, the common cold is a coronavirus. So
that's what it is.
It is. So, it's a different type of coronavirus. It's not the SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19. Still hate that name, COVID-19. It's a terrible name. I do not like it. Sam, I am. So, but nevertheless, it's also a coronavirus. So apparently this coronavirus can manifest in a number of different ways, from very, very mild, and that's how it hits most people, to something, that seems pretty severe. And you can get really sick from it and, die from it if you don't get the right treatment at the right time. That seems clear enough that we have had people get really sick and die from it. It's just such a small percentage. So how many people in our country have had it, and then what does it mean to have had it? I mean, goodness gracious, there are so many questions we don't know the answer to. If you've had it, do you have immunity going forward? We don't know the answer to that question yet. Are there multiple strains of this circulating? Has it mutated? I mean, was there a different strain in Italy, for instance, than what we saw maybe in California? Are those two different strains? And there's been talk of that. Was there a different strain in China that manifested versus what went to Europe? Why are the death counts different? And then there's just so many ways to look at this. It's a fascinating topic, Pat, and I wish we had more answers. I wish we could give you more solid answers. But, the one thing we try not to do here is to gloss over things a bunch for people. We try not to just give you the headline answer that the media organizations, by and large, are trying to get to. Just tell us the answer. Is it as deadly as they say or not? Well, it's a little more complicated than that. Are there multiple strains circulating? What are the ways that this particular disease manifests in different people? And we're reading more now about long-term manifestations. After you've apparently gotten better, you may still have after effects. And I saw somebody was even saying that it's our generation's polio, and we just haven't realized it yet because of the number of after effects that go with getting this particular disease.
And we're back on the Morgan Streetman Show. So much to get into already that we didn't get a chance to do our quick look back or our local interest story. So let's take that quick look back. And what we want to talk about today, Morgan, when you think about people who are actually, they get that headline news of, okay, Russia interfered with the DNC and the server.
Right. Russia hacked our election.
Right. If you ask most people that, then they would say, yes, of course that happened. Mm-hmm. But there's a little bit more to it than that.
Well, there is. But the media has repeated it over and over and over again. And if you'll remember, the Russian interference in the election would say, Russia hacked our democracy. That's what the headline is, right? And they've said it so many times that, frankly, most of us believe it's true because we've just heard it so many times. And as we try to tell you on this show, you need to remember that in the mind of propagandists, a lie repeated often enough becomes the truth. Mm-hmm. So if they just keep telling it to you and CNN just keeps filling your brain with the noise, eventually it brainwashes you. That's brainwashing. That's what it does. It reprograms the way you think about something by overwhelming you with false data. So we've heard Russia hacked our election now for, years we've been hearing that. Basically, ever since Donald Trump came into office, when he was inaugurated, it started at around that time. And if you remember, President Obama, before Trump was even inaugurated, put sanctions onto Russia for interfering in our election. So that was kind of the initial maneuver, and that's where the story started. Well, what we've come to learn, and it was what we knew all along, and that is that the story is false. There were two pieces, and we've talked about both pieces extensively to this whole Russian hacking claim. The first piece was that Russian troll farms, based out of Macedonia, which is Greece, by the way, Russian troll farms ran all of these Facebook memes, and that changed everybody's mind. Now, remember, this is something they spent, and we don't have the exact numbers, but we do have congressional testimony that we've played before of it being like, in the $5,000 range is what they spent on Google and less than $10,000 on Facebook. So let's just round up and give them the benefit of the doubt. But say they spent something less than a total of $50,000 on this campaign. Now, if that's enough to sway an election, why did Hillary Clinton lose? Right? Hillary Clinton had raised a billion, not 50,000, $1 billion. And by the way, you can go out and you can find these memes that were posted. They're not that impressive. They're really not impressive at all. They're not issue specific. They're just generalized memes. I encourage people to go out there and look at them. You cannot trust the media characterizations of these situations. You can't just take the media's word for it. Go look for yourself. You're an intelligent person. You've at least got some common sense. All of us are capable of evaluating these things for ourselves. And we've to a degree, seem to have lost that. We say, I don't know. I got to go with what the experts say. No, you don't. You don't have to go with what the experts say. You're a free person. You have the right to go and look at the information and decide for yourself what you think about it. And that's what I want you to do. I want you to go out there and go look up these memes that were posted. And you come back and you tell us, give us a call and tell us if you think that would have swayed you in any way.
You've looked at them.
I've looked at them a bunch of times. We've talked about them, in detail on the show, what the memes are, what the posts say. If you think this swayed the election, you've got a terrible disrespect for the American voter, number one. Number two, I don't understand why Hillary couldn't have employed the same strategy. This is not complicated stuff. But again, we get this narrative that the Russians, they're like magicians. It may look stupid what they're doing, but you just don't understand how powerful they really are. They're fooling everybody. They even got you fooled. You looked at this and you think it's nothing, but they've changed the entire country's mind using $50,000 or less funded through a Macedonian troll farm. I mean, how can you not see this? How can you not understand, right? You're stupid. That's how they treat you. That's how the media treats us and how they treated us for 3 years about this. Okay, that was one piece of the Russians hacking our election. The other piece of the Russians hacking our election mythology is that the Russians hacked the DNC server. They broke into the DNC server and stole the emails, and then they published those emails through WikiLeaks. And that turned the entire, because people actually saw how these D.C. insiders like John Podesta and Hillary Clinton operate. Yeah, it was a stomach-turning experience to see how they actually operate behind the scenes. But here's the thing. The Russians didn't hack those emails. That's the thing. And they never had any evidence that they did. And that's what we've been telling you for 3 years. We've told you that for 3 years. There are actual professionals, a long time, probably the most decorated NSA analyst in the history of the National Security Agency, Bill Binney. We've told you about him at length. He was Edward Snowden in October of 2001. He was Snowden before Snowden was cool. Before Snowden was a thing, there was a guy who blew the whistle back in October 2001. Now, he did it through the proper channels, so he didn't do what Snowden did, which, is generally considered not to have gone through the channels, although that's a more complicated story, but let's just try to stick to it here. But Bill Binney, he blew the whistle internally and resigned because he would not stand for the program that he created being turned and used against United States citizens domestically. That was not what he created, the electronic monitoring program that was used in the rest of the world. He didn't create it for domestic use. He believed that violated the Constitution. It so plainly does. And he resigned in protest and would not continue with that. But the guy is a very skilled NSA analyst and mathematician. He writes code, ciphers. I mean, he's a genius. And he's looked at the data related to the documents stolen from the DNC. And because of the speed at which the documents are saved, he can tell that that was done via a local transfer. What does that mean? That means somebody plugged a thumb drive, most likely, into the computer and moved the files from the computer onto the thumb drive. And we even know who that person was, we think. We have, as the NSA might say, we have a high degree of confidence that we know who that person was. It was a person named Seth Rich, who was objecting to the fact that the DNC and the Hillary Clinton campaign, which had merged together, the campaign had taken over the party, were actively working to deny Bernie Sanders the chance at the nomination. That's why the emails were exfiltrated or taken out of the DNC, was to show that that was what was going on. All right, so that's what Seth Rich did. But if we listen to the mainstream media for the last 3 years, that was a Russian hack. Why couldn't that have happened? Because the transfer speeds for this data being taken out of the DNC, what they call exfiltrated, the transfer speeds over the internet are much slower. So you would be able to tell by the exact timestamp on the file how fast it had been moved off and created. And if you've ever downloaded a big file over the internet, you get a sense of what I'm talking about. It doesn't happen instantaneously. Whereas if you plug a thumb drive in and you just drag and drop it, it moves right over and you can unplug the thumb drive right away. And those files are created very quickly because the process of transferring them doesn't take very long. All right, so now let's get into it because we've talked around it quite a bit. So what has come out in the past couple of weeks? You remember there were those 53 or maybe it was 57, I think it was 53 transcripts that were released. Now, they were released by Adam Schiff, but only under threat of being released by Rick Grinnell, the Director of National Intelligence. And those were the transcripts from the House investigations into all of these issues around the mythology that Russia hacked our election. And there's one transcript in particular that came out, and it's a transcript from an interview, sworn testimony that occurred in December of 2017 before the House Intelligence Committee. And the interview was of Sean Henry, who was the CEO of CrowdStrike. He was also the lead investigator for the forensic analysis of the DNC server. Now, what did he say? Just to sum it up, he said that they did not have any evidence that Russia took the emails. That's the summary. I'm going to read to you the actual quotes from it, but that's the summary of what he testified to. So they've known about this. They've known that the guy that ran the forensic analysis said they don't have any evidence. They've known that since December of 2017. But all in the interim, all during the meanwhile, we've had guys like Adam Schiff going on TV and saying, look, you haven't seen all the evidence that I've seen. I know there's serious, solid evidence that President Trump colluded with the Russians. Well, we now know, years later, that that was a lie because no evidence has come out. If they had even a shred of it, we would have seen it. It would have been front and center at the impeachment hearings that we just went through earlier this year, right? I mean, we would have seen this evidence from Adam Schiff. He was the lead person prosecuting the impeachment. Well, it was him and Nadler, and they were kind of fighting for control. But I'd say if you watch the impeachment, Adam Schiff was the Democrats' lead guy. He was the lead prosecutor for the impeachment, and he never showed us this evidence that he supposedly had. Well, now we have confirmation that he knew, just as like we told you, just like we knew, based on what Bill Binney told us and what we could tell from that the Russians, there's no evidence that they hacked the DNC. Now, I'm going to go through some of these quotes for you just to kind of highlight what he actually said, but understand, the summary is accurate. CrowdStrike has no evidence. In fact, nobody has any evidence that the Russians hacked the DNC server. And that's really all there is to the story.
We're back on the Morgan Streetman Show and learning that, guess what? It didn't happen. Russia didn't interfere with the election, or I shouldn't say that. I should say Russia didn't compromise DNC server.
Right. Well, if you've been listening to this show and if you trust us, if you take what we say and incorporate it into your own thought process, you may already have come to this conclusion because we concluded this years ago, and we've been reporting on it, the analysis that we've done internally on this years ago, that this did not occur. And we've showed you the evidence. We've showed you the interviews. We showed you the interview where Julian Assange essentially said that he got the data from Seth Rich. Julian Assange is WikiLeaks, right? So he said he got the data from a source that he couldn't reveal, and it could be Seth Rich. If you remember that interview, I don't have the clip handy, but I mean, he pretty well said it was Seth Rich if you read between the lines. But we're sharing with you now that all of the folks involved in this, in the government side, from the House Intelligence Committee, all the impeachment managers, all those people knew back in December of 2017 that the group that investigated this CrowdStrike didn't find anything. So I'm going to read you some quotes. This is from the CEO of CrowdStrike and the lead investigator on this forensic investigation, Sean Henry. And he said, quote, "We did not have concrete evidence that the data was exfiltrated from the DNC, but we have indicators that it was exfiltrated." Exfiltrated just means taken out of or removed from, right? So we didn't have concrete evidence that the data was removed from the DNC, but we have indicators that it was removed. Okay, well, what does that mean? Indicators that it was removed? Well, he says, quote, "There are times when we can see data exfiltrated, and we can say conclusively. But in this case, it appears it was set up to be exfiltrated, but we just don't have the evidence that it actually left." Oh, that's interesting, because maybe it didn't leave out over the network, like we've said. Maybe it left out by being transferred to a thumb drive. All right, here's another quote for you. "There's not evidence that they were actually exfiltrated. There's circumstantial evidence, but no evidence that they were actually exfiltrated." No evidence. Here's another one. "There's circumstantial evidence that the data was exfiltrated off the network. We didn't have a sensor in place that saw data leave. We said that the data left based on the circumstantial evidence. That was the conclusion that we made." Now, remember, this conclusion has been treated as though it was gospel, like it was backed up by evidence. This is true. This is what look, CrowdStrike looked at this. Remember, the FBI didn't even look at it. They just took CrowdStrike's word for it. Who is CrowdStrike, right? When did they become in charge? No, but you have to understand, they looked at it. Oh, okay. Here's another one. When he was asked directly if he could say unequivocally whether or not it was infiltrated out of the DNC, Sean Henry told the committee, "I can't say," based on that. based on the evidence that he'd seen. He can't say unequivocally that it was taken. Well, what does that sound like? Does that sound like proof beyond a reasonable doubt? Does that sound like proof of anything? Doesn't sound like there was even evidence of anything. And that is with respect to the Russians hacking. Now, meanwhile, at the same time now, we've got China actively threatening to hack our elections or to do something. And they've said basically based on what some American politicians have done, that they are not just going to strike back symbolically, but they will impose countermeasures that will make us feel pain. You know how the Chinese sometimes speak in their language. It's very sort of loaded up language.
So Russia was
almost
just a dress rehearsal then.
Yeah, that's right. Watch out now, for China's really coming. But they're specifically talking about people like Josh Hawley in Missouri, and I'm sure they're thinking about Tom Cotton, Senator Cotton in Arkansas, and they're saying we're going to target these people because they're trying to hold China responsible for coronavirus. They're trying to tell the truth about China, and we don't like that. So here's a quote, Republicans who have been groundlessly accusing China and inflaming the holding China accountable political farce will face severe consequences, sources said, noting that the aftermath will also impact the upcoming November elections, while business and trade between Missouri and China will be further soured. So that's a quote from the paper. And they're saying, the paper is saying its sources are reporting to it. Now, the paper is the Global Times in China, which, like all the media in China, is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So you have the appearance of choice, the appearance of options. But at the end of the day, if you follow all the little media trails back to their source, they're all coming from the same place, the Chinese Communist Party. And sadly, that's very similar to what happens in this country when you start to trace all the different channels and sources back. Now, the one you can't trace back to some major corporation is the Morgan Streetman Show. We can assure you of that. But you trace a lot of these others back, all these big networks, and they're back to big corporations and big corporate conglomerates and interests. So anyway, now we're going to have real interference in our election. And what are we going to do about it? What's going to be done about that? And the Chinese are so upset with us just for trying to tell the truth, right? For trying to get to the bottom of this whole coronavirus thing. And we got a couple of, Pat, I know you'll be interested in hearing some of this, because we've got about 40 different stories we could go to today. So we talked longer than I thought on our quick look back, by the way, now that we're into the third segment. I wasn't anticipating, right. I wasn't anticipating going on and on about it. So we got some stories we're probably not going to be able to get to today. But a couple that I did want to try to get to, this idea of peer-reviewed studies in the medical and scientific literature, it's the gold standard, right? If we don't have a peer-reviewed study, we can't even, in fact, probably the opposite of what's printed on the paper is true, okay? Well, here's what I got for you. I've got a peer-reviewed study that just came out. And you know what this study says? This is very interesting. Comes out of Guangdong, China. And it's got the list of authors and contributors is too long to read. It'd probably take the whole rest of the segment just to read it. But these are big laboratories and departments of various universities that all contributed to this study, and a number of researchers, all of whom are named. And the article, the study title is, Are Pangolins the Intermediate Host of the 2019 Novel Coronavirus? ? And guess what the study concludes? The study concludes that no, pangolins are not the intermediate host. So what does that mean? People say, well, it didn't go directly from a bat to a human. This is in the sort of natural transmission model, which we're a little bit agnostic about and or disbelieving of. But the natural transmission model, the idea that it went from a bat to a human, well, it didn't go directly, so they say, well, it must have gone through some other intermediate host. And they say, well, if you look at that wet market, remember, people are eating pangolins. Now, what are pangolins? They're like a little anteater-looking thing. People are eating pangolins. Can't be eating pangolins. You can't be eating bat soup. That stuff is gross, which I imagine it probably is actually gross. But in any event, let's be a little more culturally sensitive. It's not well matched to our existing taste buds. But We now have a peer-reviewed study that concludes that, in fact, pangolins are definitely not the intermediate host for the coronavirus. So just think about all of the news articles that you read that told you that's what happened. And you probably read them and thought, well, that sounds pretty true. It sounds reasonable to me. I mean, what do I know? I'm not a scientist, right? It sounds, well, okay, so it went through the pangolins at the wet market. Well, now here's a peer-reviewed study says that's not true. That's not true. Another study came out recently. And what I'm trying to do by sharing these studies with you is to illustrate the uncertainty of what we consider to be scientific knowledge. We think we know stuff, but it ought to always come with a caveat that says we think this is the truth, but there may be things that we learn in the future that tell us that this isn't the truth. But that's not the way they deliver it, right? They tell you things like, if we don't lock down the country, there will be 2.2 million deaths in the country. Remember that? If we don't, that was based on a model. Well, now we've learned that model was flawed. The assumptions that went into the model, even the numbers that went into the model, it wasn't accurate. That didn't happen anywhere in the world. That didn't happen in Sweden. They didn't have that kind of death rate in Sweden where they didn't go into lockdown. And we now know those models were flawed and they were revised. But when they were given out to the public, they weren't given out as, hey, by the way, we don't know this. This is just a thought we're having right now. This is a possibility. Could be flawed, could be wrong. Our assumptions may not be accurate. These numbers may be wildly inflated. That's not how they put it to us, right? They told us, no, this is what will happen. You have to understand, folks, you're not a scientist. You can't possibly understand. Just trust the scientists, and the scientists tell us the following. Well, here's another study that came out, and I want to be clear, this one isn't peer-reviewed, so take all your pot shots at this study. Speaking of pot shots, we got to talk a little bit, if we can, about that L.A. fire. Okay, but take all your pot shots at this study out of Flinders University in Australia, and this study determined that the coronavirus did not likely come from an animal source, that it is optimized for penetration into human cells via the ACE2 receptors that many of us have heard about. But this particular virus is optimized for penetration into human cells, not animal cells. So it probably didn't come out of animals if it's optimized to human. And the study concludes that this implies that the virus may have been created in a lab. Now, there's no conclusion that it definitely was created in a lab, but it says this would be a remarkable coincidence or a sign of human intervention at some level. That doesn't mean it was created from scratch in a lab. That may have means it was picked up by the lab and then run through some different, intermediate animals and somehow modified genetically through the many processes that they have for doing that in the lab. And it was modified to, more optimally bind to the human ACE2 receptor than to the animal ACE2 receptor. Now, again, that's not a final conclusion. That's just another thought. But you've got to keep these things in mind, and you've got to understand how little we actually know about this at this time, how little we can really hang our hat on in the case of this coronavirus. Now, and there comes the music. We haven't done our local interest that I did want to hit on, but let's talk a little bit, Pat George. You have a clip. I don't know if we have time to get to that. We're going to see. We'll hit that in the next segment, I think. But, if you didn't see, there was a huge fire in Los Angeles. And you got to go out there and check out the video. Pat, you showed it to me earlier today.
Yeah, it's still a crime scene.
It's a crime scene. I mean, this was a place that made a product of marijuana, which is what they call butane honey oil. And basically they pour butane over the marijuana, and it strips out all the active particles that you might want to ingest to get high. And it takes those with the butane, and then they dry off the butane, and what's left, I guess, is a very concentrated oil that they call butane honey oil. So this was a factory that made that, and boy, did it blow.
Welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. We got to get ready to go out there, Morgan, but I know there are few things we still need to hit on because, as usual, we couldn't get through everything.
I'll tell you, we got a lot to hit on. And even our biggest story of the day, we still haven't really gotten to it. I'm sorry about that. It had to do with General Flynn. And I don't know that we're really going to have a chance to go through it and do it justice. But let's stay with this L.A. thing. And, Pat, I know you've got some clips or a clip to play for us that will kind of take us.
This is actually the audio when the explosion just
you got to see
happened.
this video. I mean, the firefighters, you feel terrible for them. And I mean, they were right in the middle of a fireball. It exploded.
Mayday, from Engine 9. Engine 9, go with your mayday. Explosion. I have 2 down firefighters in front of truck 9. Copy, Engine 9, 2 down firefighters. Group Rescue 9, I need you to go and assist Engine 9 with the 2 down firefighters.
And then it goes on. There's a little bit of a break there while they're trying to adjust themselves to start heading in there. And then he comes back on and says he has 6 down now. And I just get chicken skin hearing that.
Well, and several of them are still in critical condition. I mean, they're in real trouble.
That's terrifying.
It's absolutely terrifying. Guys running into the fire.
Yes.
And, Pat, you even made the question before the show. You said, why would they be running into that building like that? I mean, what in the world in there could they have been trying to save people? I'm sure it was they didn't know if there were people in there.
3 were on the roof. 3 firemen that were on the roof, and the roof went out.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Well, okay, let's do our local interest story real quickly here, because speaking of somebody who didn't run in when he had the opportunity to do so, and that's a sergeant in the Broward County Sheriff's Department, Brian Miller, that we're all probably familiar with. We all remember him, although we may not know his name, but we remember the video of him not going into the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, right? And that was in February of 2018. That wasn't all that long ago that the Parkland shooting happened. And, of course, that kicked off a whole firestorm that wound up engulfing also the sheriff at the time of Broward County, Scott Israel. He was removed subsequently by the governor and replaced by Sheriff Gregory Toney. And Sheriff Toney last year in June of 2019 fired or terminated Brian Miller, the deputy who was basically hiding behind a pillar and didn't go into the school to try and stop the shooting that was ongoing. Now, an internal investigation found that Deputy Miller had neglected his duties. He failed to coordinate or direct other deputies' actions, and he did not direct or coordinate an immediate response into the school. And it found that all of those reasons gave rise to a basis for terminating him over a year later. Now, what's happened since then is an arbitrator has just ruled that the Broward County Sheriff's Office failed to afford Deputy Miller due process. What is due process? Well, it basically means an opportunity to know what the charges are against you, to meet them with your evidence, to confront the witnesses, things like that. It doesn't mean maybe all that much more than the opportunity to know and present your own defense. So I would assume he got that at some level in the internal investigation, but they said no. And I don't know all the details of why the arbitrator ruled this way, but the arbitrator found that the sheriff's office failed to afford him due process, so he will be reinstated. He will receive back pay, missed overtime, accrued holidays, and other benefits to which he would have been entitled had his employment been maintained. Now, what I'd like to know, personally, is did this guy go out and get another job? Or was he just hanging his hat on, I'm going to sue to be reinstated? Because most people can't afford to do that, so I think he probably got another job is my guess. He's probably working somewhere, right? Mm-hmm. Do we get credit back for the money that he earned there, or does he get double paid now? I mean, is that the deal? He gets double paid after what, I mean, it's on video what he did. And I'm not trying to condemn the guy or judge him overly, but I mean, my goodness, you got firefighters running into a burning building. You got a cop hiding behind a pillar while there's an ongoing shooting at a high school. Kids. You could have gone in and tried to save them.
That doesn't happen anymore. That changed the rules because of that.
Well,
you do run in now.
You better. And we talked about it at the time. Okay, so what we really can't get to the General Flynn thing. The list came out last week. So much interesting stuff about the Flynn case, and I do want to just touch on it, and we'll see if then I can get into our out there with sufficient time to give you something. But, they released the list of the people in government who asked to have General Flynn unmasked in the various intercepts. That means to have his name revealed. And so the list is quite long. It goes on for 3 pages, single space, so you need to take a look at the list. And what I would call your attention to is, if you remember, they've all said, this was all about his conversation with the Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak. And he had several conversations. Remember, these were about the sanctions that President Obama at the time had put on the Russians on his way out the door. And here's the thing. Those telephone conversations occurred on December 29th of 2016. December 29th. You look at the unmasking requests, though, and they start November 30th of 2016. Samantha Powers, the first one, the ambassador to the UN, the first one to request General Flynn to be unmasked, and she asked 5 or 6 more times for him to be unmasked. We got James Clapper on there early December, then December 28th, the day before. Then in January, we got John Brennan on there, December 14th and 15th. We've got a whole slew of Treasury officials asking for him to be unmasked in mid-December, December 14th. We've got James Comey, December 15th, on and on, all the way up to you get to the Chief of Staff to the President, Dennis McDonough, on January 5th. Remember, that's the date they had that meeting in the Oval Office with Comey and Rice and Obama and Biden. Remember the Buy the Book meeting, the Buy the Rules for Radicals book meeting? You've got Vice President Joe Biden requesting the unmasking on January 12th of 2017. So he's involved in this, but so many of these requests came before that call was even issued. So what does that tell you? That tells you they were looking for a way and a reason. They were trying to get General Flynn from the get-go. Just like we've told you, President Obama absolutely hated him. That's why he fired him, because he was blowing the whistle on what Obama was really doing with respect to radical Islam. Okay. Now, to go out there, and we'll see if we have time. I don't know if I'm going to have time to get this read into the record for you here, but I'm going to try to read you a little bit by a speech from an Italian politician. Obviously, this is translated to the Italian parliament about Bill Gates. And she basically called Bill Gates as an international criminal, she said, and she called for his arrest for vaccine crimes for what he's done. And you need to look into this. You need to look into Bill Gates and what he's done with vaccines around the world, how many children have been hurt and killed. But she says, you are going on anesthetizing minds with corrupted mass media, with disinfectant, with neuro-linguistic programming. I mean, this is some pretty deep stuff. If you read about this stuff, you know what she's talking about.
Isn't that the Tony Robbins stuff? Neuro-linguistic. You've been using
We need
Tony
more time for NLP. I, by the way, am not. I know about it just on the surface level. I am not a practitioner or a student of NLP. But she goes on to say, it's our children who will lose more, who are raped souls, with the so-called guarantor of their rights being the Italian Coordination of Services Against Child Abuse. In this way, the school will be granted only a bracelet to get them used to probation. Anyway, she just goes on and on. We really don't have time. I planned to read you a longer version of it, but we didn't quite get through it. But she accuses Bill Gates of starting this pandemic based on Event 201 that he held last year. I'm Morgan Streetman, and that's the way I see it. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.